Hello, and welcome to the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible, but were afraid to ask. I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker, and today, Katie wasn't able to join us for this particular podcast, but we have a wonderful special guest today. Dr. Love Sechrest is the Associate Provost and Professor of Theology at Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland, and the author of the recent book, Race and Rhyme, Rereading the New Testament, which is a womanist reading of several texts from the New Testament. She's a New Testament scholar, and that book is published by Erdman. So welcome, Love. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a delight.
Oh, good. Well, so this is going to be a two-parter, which we sometimes do because the topic is so large. So we had a question from one of our listeners, and again, as our regular listeners know, you can go to the enterthebible.org website to ask a question of your own, which we will try to address on this podcast. But the question for today is an important topic, both for biblical interpretation, but also for current events, as it's very relevant for today. And the question is this: what did Jesus have to say about race and ethnicity? And so, in this first part of this topic, we're going to talk or concentrate more about concepts of race and ethnicity in Jesus' time. And then in part two, we're going to talk about specific New Testament texts that Dr. Sechrest has written on. So, Love, I know this is a big topic. What did Jesus have to say about race and ethnicity? How would you begin to address it?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to your readers for the question. It's one that is near and dear to my heart. I have been focused on trying to understand what the Bible has to say about race and ethnicity since I was a doctoral student. Like these were the questions that I was asking as I was first starting, a very in-depth, close reading of the New Testament. And and in fact, my first book, which grew out of my dissertation, is all about that question, but it's focused on the Apostle Paul, like his writings, versus the Gospels, which we're going to talk about today.
Okay.
But in that book,
tell our listeners the name of that first book, Love.
Yeah. That first book is called A Former Jew, Paul and the Dialectics of Race, and it's with Bloomsbury. Now is the publisher of that book, and in it, I was intrigued because I noticed in graduate school that as I was reading a lot of the early Jewish texts that many New Testament scholars and biblical scholars read, like Josephus, who was a historian,
right,
Jewish
historian around the New
Jewish
Testament
historian in the Roman period, Philo, who was a Jewish theologian or philosopher, writing pretty contemporaneous with the time of Jesus as well. And in both of their readings, and they have voluminous writings, right? But in both of them, they use the word genos in the Greek, which is translated, among many things. It has a number of different translations, but one of them is race. And I was particularly intrigued when they talked about the race of Israel, right? Like the Jewish people or the Jewish race. And I would always wonder, what is it that they meant by that? It can't be what we mean by that today. What is it that they meant by that? And that's what that first book explores. I found that there were a lot of similarities between what we mean by race today and what they meant. For instance, there's a very close relationship between our concept of race and our concept of ethnicity. So much so that many scholars are beginning, and I follow them, in talking about ethno-racial as a
Right.
way of showing that these concepts, ethnicity and race, are very close in many, many respects. And similarly, in the ancient world, there was a Greek word. I've already talked about the Greek word genos. Well, there was
Mhm.
another Greek word, ethnos. And this is the word from which we derive the contemporary word ethnicity. But in our Bibles, that word shows up all over the place. Ethnos does, and
Mm.
it's mostly translated Gentiles, right?
Ah,
And what the ancient Israelites, the early Christians, meant when they said ethnos is they were talking about over and against Jewish, right? Like there were
okay.
Jews and there were Gentiles. Gentile isn't really a racial group, but it is a way of signifying everyone else, right? Like
So
we're talking about
non-Jews. Yeah,
not Jews.
not
It was
Jews.
really the
Okay.
way.
Okay.
What you really couldn't find a person who was a Gentile who might self-identify that way. They might call themselves a Greek or a Roman
Right. Okay.
or a Syrian. They would talk about their homeland. So I found that the concepts in the ancient world of referring to a homeland are very common with how we think about it today, right? That when we talk about ethnic groups, we're usually or like Jewish Americans, right?
Right.
Or Italian Americans or German Americans. We're really African Americans. We're talking about a homeland,
Right. Okay.
and sort of the connection with a center of gravity with the homeland is also very common with how race and ethnicity were understood in the ancient world. One way in which at least the ancient Jewish people differed is that is that even more than a homeland, and it kind of makes sense because Jews were in a diaspora, right?
Right.
They were
Right.
for a long
Scattered.
period of time.
Mhm.
Even more than a homeland, their religion, their convictions about the God of Abraham were self-defining, more so than a homeland. Not that a homeland wasn't important. Israel and
Right.
Palestine
Right.
were very important, but of sometimes greater importance was the convictions they had about their God, their religion, and
So can
so
I
that becomes yeah
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I'm wondering
no
if I'm gonna try this out and see if this is right.
hmm.
So I'm an Old Testament scholar, Hebrew Bible, right?
Hmm.
And in the Old Testament, you talk about the goyim, the nations, right, surrounding Israel.
Hmm.
So there's this sense of whatever the Moabites or the Ammonites or the Amalekites or whoever, right? They're associated with they're different nations, right, surrounding Israel. And Israel itself is a nation or a people, but
Among them.
as after the exile, during the exile, and after the exile, as the Jews are scattered, first the Israelites and then the Jews are scattered across the ancient Near Eastern world. It's not so much about nationhood as it is about peoplehood. Does that
Peoplehood, yes,
Is that
that's a
fair to say?
great one.
Okay.
That's in fact people, or some of the translations of that word genos are tribe, people, um, uh, nation, all of those or even like just sort of a swarm, right? A race of bees. One ancient writer uses that. It's
Genos.
sort of a type.
Okay.
It's getting at the idea of a type of a people or
Okay.
a
Okay.
type of an animal,
Right.
group, etc.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a great way of thinking about it. Um, and uh, um, and I think that's one big difference is in terms of how Jewish people by the time of Jesus had begun to think about themselves as a sort of their religion was what differentiated them more from the people around them than just their territorial origins, right? By that time,
Yeah,
not that they weren't.
that's really
Yeah,
helpful. And religion, I think, as Christians, we sometimes think religion is what you believe, which is certainly part of it. But for Jews, especially, the practices, the religious practices, right, of keeping Sabbath, of circumcision, of keeping kosher, my doctor father was Jewish, John Levinson, and he
yeah,
talks about the reason Jews still survived is because they have a particular cookbook, right? And circumcision and Sabbath, of course. That these practices distinguish them from the nations around them or the people among whom they live.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with him. I think that the practices that differentiated them, and for the ancient Jews, it was even also difficult to separate out their politics from their practices. It was defining. It was a defining idea for them, that the religion told them where to live, how to live, what
Yeah,
to eat, what
yeah,
to do, who to obey, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah,
all of that was wrapped up in and that is the world that Jesus enters. That's the world that begins to differentiate, especially after the death of Jesus, a new type,
mm,
right? Not just Jews, not just Gentiles, but Christians as well. And in later New Testament writings and post biblical early Christian writings, right? The Christian race is actually becomes a new construct, and that's what I was so curious about, and what
yeah,
started me off on this whole trajectory about talking about race. Now, if we want to sort of switch to like a historical understanding of what the people were saying about themselves to actually what's in the Bible. Um, I think the best way of thinking about that is to differentiate the what's similar from what's different, and this religious component is one of the major differences, as I've also said. But some of the things that are similar show up in the Gospels, which are primarily concerned about the story of Jesus as well. So, like the intergroup tensions
mm,
that we experience today. Whereas today, those tensions, at least in the United States, but you can make a case that even in many countries around the globe, um, skin color becomes one defining way of talking about major divisions, right? And they can connect with and intersect with other ways of defining people, like economic status.
mhm,
Um, I have often had people say, yeah, well, in say South America, we don't think about race as black and white the same way Americans do. And I will say, yeah, well, tell me about the poor in your country. Do they skew darker or do they not? Right? And you'll
yeah,
find a way that skin color intersects with
mm,
other kinds of important social components like economics. But it's true to say that in the American context, in the U.S. context, skin color has become like the defining way of talking about race, of and it's the tension between blacks and whites, um, and in some ways also whites and Native Americans, that has been the defining tension that has sorted ethnic groups throughout U.S. history on into today. Um, that tension isn't the same in the ancient world. That the when it comes to, say, thinking about who was enslaved in Jesus's day, there were conquered peoples of any skin color,
mm,
right? It wasn't
yeah,
really a skin color kind of thing. So that's a pretty important difference. But one of the major similarities, and one of the ways in which I have sought to find leverage for how the Bible can be helpful in thinking about the racial conflict that we have today, is in looking at the ways that intergroup conflict shows up in the Bible. Let's start with one well-known one, like Pharisees versus
yeah,
Sadducees
right.
versus the Jesus followers, right? Like
Mhm,
that becomes a critical tension that goes through the gospel stories. But I've already talked about Jews on one hand. Christian Jews or Jewish Christians, however you want to talk about, or Gentiles, like the tensions among those groups become very helpful for thinking about tensions. And the gospel that we were going to talk about today, the Gospel of Matthew, really has a lot of those kind of tensions show up in quite a number of ways that is interesting. For instance, the Gospel of Matthew starts with a genealogy, right?
yeah,
And
right.
it identifies Jesus by his tribal origins, right? And is noteworthy in the senses that it includes sort of the relationships that non-Jews had over time, right? Like one of the things that I've heard Old Testament scholars say, and maybe you can elaborate on this, is that in the ancient Israelite context, it's really hard to separate out like a pure strain of this people group from another people group, that there was a lot of intermingling, and that you see that same thing even in Jesus's genealogy.
Yeah, you see that famously. There's only 4 women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew 1, and they're all 4, um, kind of marginalized women
Yeah,
for various reasons.
yep,
Tamar is the first one, who is Judah's not wife exactly, but actually daughter-in-law, and then yeah, mother of his children. And Tamar is a Canaanite, as far as we know,
yeah,
right? She's not an Israelite. And then you have Ruth, who is, of course, a Moabite, famously,
yeah, yeah,
who joins herself to the nation of Israel, right? But she's not herself Israelite; she's a Moabite. And then, of course, you have Bathsheba, though in the Matthew's gospel, she's not named; she's called the wife of Uriah. And there's
yeah.
some debate whether she's Israelite or not, but she's certainly she's not she there's some right the circumstances of Bathsheba and David's relationship is of course fraught
Fraught. Yes,
with power dynamics and
yes,
yeah,
yes.
anyway, that's a story for another time. um and who am I
Yeah,
missing?
but it
Oh,
does.
Rahab, of course, I missed Rahab. Yeah,
Right. Yep. Hmm.
before Ruth even, the father of the mother of Boaz is Rahab, who is
Yeah.
again, of course, a Canaanite, who saves the really dense Israelite spies right at the beginning of
Right.
Joshua. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting way to begin the
It
gospel, to
is.
say that Jesus is not pure, or
Yes.
in the
Right.
sense
He's
of
mixed.
racially pure that
He's
white
mixed.
supremacists talk about today, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. He is mixed,
right,
right?
right.
He is part Canaanite,
Yeah,
in some sense, right? Like that's something that many, or at least one leading womanist scholar, Mitzi Smith, talks about, and tries to highlight that aspect of Jesus' identity as a way for us to reflect on
yeah,
today, in light of some of the right the discourse
right.
in some sort of fascist kind of discourse that wants to talk about purity,
Yeah, right.
racial purity, in a way that just doesn't bear up under scrutiny, right?
No,
Even Jesus
exactly,
um,
exactly. Yeah,
is one can be is identified in our holy book, in along those lines. But there are other of these moments in the Gospel of Matthew that seem loaded with sort of ethnic tension as well. There's the another highlight moment really is the Great Commission,
hmm.
which is kind of I'm going to actually bring this up right now in my Bible software so that I can get the wording. Therefore, go and make disciples. I'm reading 28:19, Matthew 28:19.
Hmm.
Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So, right there, there's a moment which, depending on your ideology, has been a sort of, it has become a fraught moment. It's not necessarily fraught in the context of Matthew, but in as much as that kind of an ideology of taking over, right, other countries and imposing your perspective or your religious views on another country has been associated with the evils of colonialism and conquest, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Like and there's one African woman scholar Musa Dube, who writes about that in her book Post-Colonial Feminist Interpretation of the Bible. She talks about like this ideology that has come to dominate parts of U.S. history and world history, right? Taking off from this sort of importing conquest notions into the spread of Christianity. So that can be a problematic moment. This isn't what I don't think Jesus had in mind, but
Yeah.
what's interesting is that we don't talk a lot about verse 20, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, which is a really interesting, very Jewish moment, right? Like
Right.
in
Yeah.
that,
The
because
rabbi.
Jesus, right, he's a rabbi and he
Mhm.
teaches about the correct interpretation of Torah. That's really what Jesus has been doing throughout the Gospel of Matthew, has been saying, your interpretations of Torah are this, but I say
Mm.
this is what God the Father meant or prefers in terms of how you interpret Scripture. So it's both a very, it's kind of, I want to say that Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, has these universalizing
Right.
tendencies, right? Go to all nations and teach them. But
Right.
it also has these very particularistic tendencies as well, teaching them all about Torah, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's a very particularistic move.
Well, it
There
kind of reminds me of Isaiah, right? Like Isaiah 2,
it does.
where all the nations are going to come together, right? And we're going to beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks, which is just this beautiful vision, right?
A
That has
beautiful
never
vision.
been realized yet in world history, right? So it's universalistic in that kind of sense, but it's also very particular, right? What mountain are they coming to? Mount Zion,
Yeah.
right? The
Mount
mountain of the
Zion.
Lord's house, to
That's
worship
right.
the God of Israel, right? So it's not kind of all paths lead to the same, mountaintop. It's a very particular God, right? The God of
Yeah.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that all the nations are coming to worship in a very particular
Yes.
place in Jerusalem.
In a very particular place. And I think you begin to see those tensions in the text that we are going to explore in just a little bit. But there are moments in Matthew 10, for instance, right in the beginning of the chapter, Matthew 10:5. This is where in the narrative, Jesus has sent the disciples out to do their own missionary journey. In fact, chapter 10 is called the Missionary Discourse. It's where he's teaching them about how they should interact with conflict, how they should preach the good news. And but the first thing he says as he's sending them out is, "Don't go among the Gentiles or into a Samaritan city." Right?
Yeah,
It's a
right.
very particularistic moment. And in Matthew 15, which is the text where Matthew engages, or I'm sorry, Jesus engages with the Canaanite woman, this whole interaction between Jesus and the Canaanite woman is one that is just loaded with ethnic discourse or ethnic influences. It talks about. I just want to read a little bit. Jesus went to the regions of Tyre and Sidon, which are outside of Israel. So it's a moment where Jesus is going into territory outside of Israel, having just told that, or some chapters back, having told the disciples that isn't a part of their mission.
Mhm.
So there's that. So there's that tension happening right then. And then a Canaanite woman from those territories came out and shouted, "Show me mercy, Son of David."
Mm.
Very interesting there. That first of all, she's mentioned as a Canaanite, which is harkens back
Right.
to sort of an ancient way of thinking about the other. Not she's not a Gentile who of origin, which Matthew uses the word Gentile all over the place, but she's a Canaanite, which immediately sort of evokes the legacies of hostility and
Right.
animus
Right.
and war, right? That have between Israel sort of and their chief opponents that have gone through many Old Testament history, right? The
Right.
history of the Jewish people. So by calling her that, Matthew who's actually recording this, right? Who is putting this story together. He's reflecting on the Jesus tradition and writing it down in ways that sort of reflect his cultural context,
Mm.
and calling this woman a Canaanite. So already we have ethnic tension, but then she calls him son of David,
Yeah.
which is a sort of a messianic title to give to. So it's very much like having a foreign king come to your homeland
Mm-hmm.
and address him as if he's your king.
Yeah.
Uh, right? Like, so it's so already she is exhibiting she's making a political and religious statement in a way that, just peeking ahead to the end of the story, that goes beyond what he might have seen in his own homeland, right?
Yeah.
Whereas he's engaging in conflict with the religious leaders of the day. Here's this outsider
Yeah.
already giving him the deference and heralding him as a messianic figure when so many inside Israel have not yet been able to come to that conclusion, or still are really grappling hard with that conclusion.
Yeah, so
Um,
she's seeing things that even his own disciples, or maybe his disciple, but even yeah, people within the Jewish community don't recognize. I'm going to pause us here,
yeah, sure.
just because we're gonna move to those texts, that text and another one in Matthew, in the second part of this series. But let me just say, again, thank you for joining
Oh,
us for this podcast, Love, and I look forward to diving more into the details of the text in the next podcast, the part 2 of this podcast. So let me just say to our listeners, thank you for listening again to this episode of the Enter the Bible podcast. Come back for part 2, and you can get high quality courses, commentaries, resources, videos, and other reflections at enterthebible.org. Thank you for joining us.